How about that started? Thank you so
Good
much.
enough.
Thank
Good
you.
enough.
Okay. Raven, Raven.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so we can start recording it. Okay, thank you so much. Good
Hmm.
evening. My name is Shelly Young. I'm a very proud employee of the South Norwalk Library, South Norwalk Branch Library, also known as SoNo Branch Library. On behalf of Sherelle Harris, the interim library director of the Norwalk Public Library, I would like to welcome all of you to tonight's Let's Talk as SoNo Jackie Gleason, the Great One program. Now, let me introduce our wonderful presenter for tonight. Mark Alverson, a Norwalk Community College history teacher and lifetime Learning Institute teacher, is a regular presenter for the SoNo Branch Libraries Let's Talk as SoNo series. Mark is a longtime member of the United States Naval Institute. In May 2005, he was presented with a General Assembly citation by both houses of Congress in Hartford, Connecticut, for his efforts in commemorating the centennial of Battleship Connecticut. Mark is the historical research editor for Army Aviation Magazine, historian for the Army Aviation Association of America, and the author of several books. Mark resides in Norwalk, Connecticut. Now, let's turn the time to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Good
You're
evening.
welcome.
Thank you for tuning into the great one, Jackie Gleason. For those who perhaps were born after Jackie Gleason was a big star, the name the Great One was accorded him by Orson Welles. And it was seconded by, after Orson Welles by one of the greatest comedians who ever lived, and that was Lucille Ball. Jackie Gleason was a great one, and he also had great depth as an actor. If you've seen movies like The Hustler, also the Requiem for a Heavyweight, which featured Anthony Quinn as the washed-up fighter. Which was screenwritten, by the way, by Rod Serling, who's known for The Twilight Zone. But Gleason was born in Brooklyn. He was actually born at 328 Chauncey Street. When he was really young, the family moved to 364 Chauncey Street. If you're a Honeymooners fan, you'll know that number because that's where Ralph and Alice lived. That's the apartment they lived in at 364 Chauncey Street in Brooklyn. Gleason applied that address from his upbringing. In fact, when he was on the Johnny Carson show for the only interview he ever gave in October of 1985, and you can YouTube that discussion very easily enough. It's an interesting discussion. And Johnny Carson asked him the question, well, a lot of what you did is a product of your upbringing in Brooklyn. He goes, oh yeah, that's right. And interestingly enough, he was on the stage for 20 minutes and he had like 4 cigarettes in that 20 minutes. He finished one, light up another. He was a chain smoker and he drank a little bit. Of course, we know that. If you ever watched the old Honeymooners show, the Jackie Gleason show from Miami Beach in the early 60s, like I did when I was a kid, you know, when the June Taylor dancers were done dancing at the beginning of the show, he would come out, they would come out, 3 girls would come out, one with a chair, one with a little table, and one with the cup and saucer, which was supposed to be tea or coffee, but you know, we don't really know. And he'd smoke a cigarette and he'd give a 5-minute monologue and then how sweet it is, and we're off and running. But he chain smoked. I mean, just like Humphrey Bogart did, just like Dean Martin did on TV, just Johnny Carson. That was the big thing then. Nowadays, you don't see a butt or a cigar on stage anymore. It's not acceptable, but it was then. It was part of the ambiance of entertainment was the cigarette. But Jackie Gleason stated that to Johnny Carson, yeah, that's right. A lot of it did come from my upbringing. He said, when I was a kid living at 364 Chauncey Street, there were 1,000 Nortons and 1,000 Kramdens, referencing, of course, Ralph Kramden, the bus driver, him and his wife, Alice, and Ed Norton, his good friend who worked in the New York City sewer system on the Honeymooners. Of course, if you know, one of those episodes, Art Carney once said that it's not, I don't work in a sewer, that's a layman's term. He said, I am an engineer in subterranean sanitation. That's what he said he was. But Jackie Gleason was born in Brooklyn at 328 Chauncey Street, and they moved to 364. He was actually John Herbert Gleason. He was baptized John Herbert Gleason. At his baptism, of course, he was named Norbert Walton Gleason Jr. at birth. His father was Norbert, but he was baptized as John Herbert Gleason. And there was quite a bit of the many years difference between his brother Clement and himself. His father, by the way, sold insurance policies. They still didn't make a lot of money. And Jackie Gleason has fond memories of his father from the perspective that he would sit at night at the kitchen table with his father, and his father would be writing insurance policies. And he remembered his father had wonderful penmanship, had a fine, steady hand with a pen or a pencil. His brother Clement, the same thing, but his brother died. You know, Jackie Gleason was born February 26, 1916, yet his brother died at age 14 in 1919 when Jackie Gleason was only 3 years old. So he was essentially, after the first 3 years, an only child. His mother, Maisie Kelly, who was from Cork in Ireland, you know, his father, Johnny Carson once asked him the question on that interview we did in the Johnny Carson show. And he said, didn't you, because he was interested in entertainment at a very early age, Jackie Gleason was. And Johnny Carson asked him, didn't you one time play Little Red Riding Hood with a Yiddish accent? And Jackie Gleason says, boy, you guys sure did your homework. And Johnny Carson goes, yeah. He says, that's right, I did. And he says, I knew then. He says, really, I knew before. I wanted to be an entertainer. And he said, his father will eventually just take up and leave. But before his father took up and left the family, he said, my father took me to a vaudeville show. And he said he got tickets, front row, right up near the stage. And he said, at the intermission, the house lights came on. And he says, so there's a 15, 20-minute break. Jackie Gleason said, I stood up. And he said, I turned around and I looked at the audience. And he said, I knew then how I wanted to look for the rest of my life. And so he did that play in grammar school, the Little Red Riding Hood with a Yiddish accent. Now, his father will take up and leave. So it's just he and his mother. And his mother gets a job with the New York City transit system. She winds up working like a ticket taker for the New York subway system, L trains, so on and so forth. If you remember, on the Honeymooners, Ralph Kramden worked with the Gotham Transit lines as a bus driver. That was inspired by his mother working for the New York City transit system. So again, he borrows from his childhood and implements those facets in his act. In fact, Johnny Carson asked him too, a lot of your characters, Reggie Van Gleason III, Ralph Kramden, Joe the bartender, loudmouth Charlie Broughton, Rudy the repairman, the poor soul. All these characters came out of people, men he knew in the neighborhood when he was growing up. And Johnny Carson asked him, well, you know, what character best represents Jackie Gleason? And Jackie Gleason named my favorite. And he says, well, I'd have to say it's Reggie Van Gleason III, that pompous, greased down hair guy with the little mustache. Who wore the tie and tail and the tux. So, every act, he was a very interesting character. He did him on vaudeville. He actually played the poor soul on Broadway. And so he took these characters, and this helps create the later Jackie Gleason shows. But his mother is not making a lot of money. And as Jackie Gleason grows up, he begins to pal around in street gangs. He also, by the way, and again, this was brought up on Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson asked him, didn't you wind up being a real big pool player in high school? And he goes, no, he said, I started at 9 years old. One of his hangouts as a little kid, 9-year-old kid, was a pool hall. Now, he said, I was the rack boy. So I would rack the balls for these guys playing. But he says they gave me a table in the back of the pool hall. And he says, I got pretty good. And so eventually he became the houseboy. In other words, guys would come in, young men would come in wanting to challenge somebody. Guess who it would be? Jackie Gleason. In fact, Jackie Gleason stated that when he graduated grammar school, this is in New York City, he graduated grammar school, he says they used to give you a gold pin, put on your jacket or your shirt, right? And so Jackie Gleason played and challenged all of his schoolmates for their gold pins. And he said later on, I put them all in a box. I went down to the hock shop and I traded them in. And so he was becoming somewhat of a shyster at this age. But as he becomes a teenager, he takes on odd jobs reminiscent of a fashion entertainment. A carnival barker, actually became a stunt car driver for a short period of time, an announcer. He also becomes a jokester, joke teller, stand-up comic. And he's working in bars, and he's not getting paid a lot. He finally is able, his mother died when he was 16 years old. So we're talking 1932, 1933. Interesting, a girl he was going with, last name was Donaghy. Her parents were willing to take him in. And if you remember the Jackie Gleason Show from Miami, and Joe the bartender, if you remember, that was the last act on the Jackie Gleason Show every Saturday night, Joe the bartender. And he would have Frank Fontaine come in, the well-known singer, as Crazy Guggenheim. And now that's an interesting side note. Frank Fontaine had a big career as a singer. Then he began to drink. He had 8 kids. Jackie Gleason gave him a part as Crazy Guggenheim on the Jackie Gleason Show to help bring him back. Because every week, there was a third character in the bar. You never see him. It's an invisible character. Jackie Gleason would face he's very innovative. He would face the camera as if he's talking to Mr. Donaghy, the guest who just walked in the bar. And then Crazy Guggenheim would come in. And at the end, every week, it ended with Jackie Gleason as Joe the bartender would say, hey, Craze, how about singing us a little song? All right, Joe. And then Jackie Gleason would say, hey, Donaghy, put a dime on number 12. And then the orchestra off stage would begin to play a song, and Frank Fontaine would sing. And he had a good voice. And so this was Jackie Gleason's way of helping a fellow entertainer. But he brought in an imaginary character based on the family that was willing to take him in. Interesting. And so Jackie Gleason said no. He had 19 cents in his pocket, left Brooklyn to go inside the center of New York City. He's going to try to make it. Again, he's stand-up comic in various bars and nightclubs and low-rated nightclubs. However, he will find an agent, and he does meet up with another comic, and they share a room together. Finally, his agent says, "Hey, I can get you a job doing some comedy skits in Pennsylvania." And so, okay, so $19 was what he was supposed to be paid, but he had to give to his agent some of that $19 for the transportation to get there. So he begins in Reading, Pennsylvania, places like Reading, Pennsylvania, and he's doing stand-up, nightclubs, so on and so forth. But he does come back to New York City, and he's again working in nightclubs, mid to late 1930s. And he wound up at the 18 Club. And Jackie Gleason said in his interview with Johnny Carson, it was the greatest nightclub there ever was. Why? He said, you couldn't do your act. You couldn't do your act here. This nightclub was interesting because big stars would show up, and usually every night, every other night. Robert Taylor, James Cagney, and Jackie Gleason said that as a young comics, we had to make fun of those who walked in, big stars. And it was all ad-lib. You did this ad-lib. And he said, Sonia Henning, world-class skater. He walked up to Sonia Henning with a fistful of ice cubes, and he says, hey, try doing something with this. This is the type of stuff they did. However, he was performing one night, and somebody from Warner Brothers was there, and they saw Jackie Gleason. They went back and told Jack Warner. Jack Warner wanted him to come in because they also saw him on stage off Broadway in a play. And they asked him to come on in. This is 1940. Jackie Gleason is signed as a Warner Brothers stock player for $250 a week. He's making peanuts at this point. Now all of a sudden he's making $250 a week. Now, as a stock player for Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, Universal, places like this. Now keep in mind, movie making was different then than it is now. The actors didn't have the freedom they have today. Not many actors were directing or producing. You were an actor and that was it. It's people like Betty Davis, Olivia de Havilland, who begin to push the issue here. In fact, I don't know how many of you know, Betty Davis was one of the first, if not the first, to get the shot at Scarlett O'Hara and Gone with the Wind. And she told the producers she didn't want to be pushed around. So it's interesting what the power Betty Davis later will have, and Olivia de Havilland as well. But Jackie Gleason is signed for $250 a week. So at $250 a week as a stock player, you take whatever they tell you to take. Could be a drama, you could be a heavy, it could be a comedic part, could be a bit part. Because they're paying you. This isn't a welfare situation here. They're paying you as a stock player. However, he gets a big break here in 1941-42. And I saw this interview with Vincent Sherman. Vincent Sherman was a director for the Warner Brothers. He was in the Warner Brothers stable. And he had been doing a lot of B movies. And I saw this interview about 10 years ago when Robert Osborne used to be the host for Turner Classic Movies. And he interviewed Vincent Sherman because they were showing movies directed by Vincent Sherman. And Vincent Sherman talked about this movie, All Through the Night. If you've never seen it, watch it. You won't be sorry. It's a comedy spy picture, and it happens in one evening. So it's got a terrific cast to it. And Vincent Sherman related this story. They made this movie. He made this movie in 8 weeks. And he says 2 weeks into the production, Jack Warner comes down. Hey, Vincent, how are things going? Oh, fine, Mr. Warner. We're right on schedule. Everything, and everybody's getting along. Everything is fine. Great. I want you to add 2 people. Oh, Mr. Warner, I've already got the movie. I'm 2 weeks into this. I got 2 guys, and I want you to put them in the comedians. Yeah, but I have some comedians. In this movie was Humphrey Bogart, William Demarest, Conrad Veidt, big name. He was a Nazi spy. Peter Lorre played his Gunsel. Wallace Ford had a Barton McLean. I mean, these are big names then. And Karen Verne, well-known German actress. Jane Darwell plays Humphrey Bogart's mother in this, and she got an Oscar for The Grapes of Wrath as Henry Fonda's mother in that superlative picture. So I had a great cast. And Jack Warner says, well, I got 2 guys. You have to put them in. Just have the screenwriters write them in, give them parts, and be done with it. So he said they did. 2 weeks into the production, they're doing this. And those two comedians were Phil Silvers and Jackie Gleason. Phil Silvers was a stock player too. But the movie is really worth watching. Of course, Bogart is the big shot here, but still, it's really it's an entertaining flick. You won't be sorry if you watch it. And this is kind of a really big step forward for Jackie Gleason. He'll be in other movies, but also now he's raising his stature in nightclubs, and also, by the way, on Broadway. However, he gets a petition to go to Pennsylvania again, and he goes there. This is in the late 1940s. But he also, his agent tells him, hey, look, CBS is launching a TV show. It's called the Cavalcade of Stars. And the Cavalcade of Stars is going to have round robin hosts. And they want you to host for $750 a night. And Jackie Gleason says, well, what I'm doing out here in Pennsylvania, I'm not coming back for just to do 2 nights for $750. I'm just not doing it. His agent contacts him again and says, hey, CBS says they don't want you for 2 nights. They want you for 4 nights. I'm coming back. Takes the train back. And he does the 4 nights. Now they want him to stay. And by 1950, this will be known as the Jackie Gleason Show. Here is where Jackie Gleason now really begins to take control of his own career. At the Park Sheraton Hotel, because I vaguely remember my mother and father, I mean, I was born in 51. And my mother and father went down there in 1950, 54, 55. And my grandmother and grandfather were babysitting me, but my mother and father went down and watched that show. And this is a time when the Honeymooners was not what you see on television. It was a 15, 20-minute skit on the Jackie Gleason Show. Now, interesting, at the same time, John, in this interview with Johnny Carson, he brought up the fact of Toots Shor. If any of you remember the Toots Shor restaurant, but then again, that needs to be corrected. Toots Shor said he never had a restaurant. He had a saloon. He was a saloon keeper. And big names went here, big names. Toots Shor. Well, early on in his career, Jackie Gleason was going in here. And Johnny Carson said to Jackie Gleason, he says, I got to know Toots Shor. He says, not as good as you did, but he told me you would walk into Toots Shor's saloon and you'd be lining up these drinks. And he said, you'd write up a bill, even when you didn't have it. That means money. And Jackie Gleason says, that's right. He said, I'd go in there, and he says, Toots Shor must have took a liking to him. Sure, he says, if you don't have it, sign for it. Sign for it. Now, how much are drinks in 1950 as compared to now? I mean, we're not talking a lot of money per drink here. But Jackie Gleason said he went in there one night and he ran up a drinking bill of $60. Then I added a $40 tip. He says, Toots Shor comes flying out of the back room. What are you doing? And Jackie Gleason said, he says, I told him, keep it up and I'll give you back your pen. But that's Gleason. Later on, when Toots Shor died, Johnny Carson brought up the fact that he says, we found out that you sent a big wreath to the funeral. Of course, Jackie Gleason went to the funeral, but he sent a big wreath. And on this wreath was a big ribbon. And on the ribbon, it said, save me a table. And Gleason looked back at Johnny Carson. There was that slight little smile, but you could tell in his eyes, there was something there. And he says, that's right. So he never forgot Toots Shor at the funeral. But Johnny Carson asked him, well, the drinking bouts, because Jackie Gleason drank. The drinking bouts, did you ever miss a performance? And Gleason said, no, never did. He says, now I'm not advocating everyone should drink. He said, I know everyone can't drink. He said, I'm not advocating everyone should drink, but he said in his own inimitable way, but it worked for me. Of course, everyone starts to laugh. But on the show, the Cavalcade of Stars, now the Jackie Gleason Show, the spot known as the Honeymooners featured Art Carney as Ed Norton, Joyce Randolph, Trixie. There was a Pert Kelton who was Alice. Pert Kelton was a very somewhat of an angry Alice. She was older than Jackie Gleason, but Gleason's going to have a problem here because she got caught up in the McCarthy hearings and she'll be blackballed. They need an Alice. Enter Audrey Meadows. She's on Broadway. She finds out Gleason needs another Alice. She goes down to the Park Sheraton Hotel. Jackie Gleason takes one look at her and says, nah, you're too pretty. I can't use you. If you compare Audrey Meadows to Pert Kelton, let's be honest here, was not one of the prettiest faces to come down the pike. I mean, to be brutally honest, she looked like a 10-year club fighter compared to Audrey Meadows. So Audrey Meadows calls up her agent. Be at my apartment tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock sharp. So, and she says, bring a photographer. So dutifully, her agent goes there and knocks on the door, 7 o'clock in the morning with a photographer. Audrey Meadows answers the door. She just got out of bed. Her hair's all over the place. No makeup, shabbily dressed. Take a picture. Take it down to Jackie. They do this. They take it down to Jackie. Jackie says, get her down here. Get her down here. Down she goes. He likes what he sees, hires her. Everyone remembers Audrey Meadows. Nobody remembers Pert Kelton. And Audrey Meadows, interesting, when Johnny Carson asked him about, the Honeymooners, and Jackie Gleason said, bending over to dump the ashes in the ashtray of the cigarette he's smoking, the second cigarette he's smoking, he said, Carney is one of the greatest actors and comedians of our times. And he said, Audrey Meadows, sensational. Audrey Meadows, I don't know how many know this, but a big fan of the Honeymooners was Cary Grant. Cary Grant loved Audrey Meadows, thought she was fantastic. Audrey Meadows got an Emmy from the Honeymooners. So did Art Carney. So did Joyce Randolph, I believe. Jackie Gleason never did. He never got an Emmy for this. But Audrey Meadows, Cary Grant really liked her. There was a movie made in 1960. It's called That Touch of Make. The two major stars were Cary Grant and Doris Day. Gig Young played a neurotic, and he was perfect in this part as a neurotic. But the part called for Doris Day living in this apartment, and the script called for her having a roommate. And Cary Grant says, I know the perfect roommate. Audrey Meadows, producers, we don't think so. We don't think she's right for the part. Cary Grant says she's perfect for the part. And they're trying to find other women. And finally, Cary Grant said, no Audrey Meadows, no Cary Grant. Well, you think they're going to throw Grant away? No, they're not. They brought her in, gave her a test. Perfect. She went over like a full-flighted balloon here. She was perfect as Doris Day's roommate. And that's another movie worth watching, That Touch of Make. It's really a funny picture. It's one of those love fest movies of the late 50s, early 60s. It's a great picture. Doris Day and Cary Grant were marvelous in it, and so was Gig Young as that neurotic business executive hired by Cary Grant. But Audrey Meadows was perfect as her roommate. So they're the Honeymooners, and Johnny Carson asked them, Jackie Gleason had this talent. He didn't like to rehearse, didn't need to, could read the script, all set to go. He said, I didn't like to rehearse. He said, I thought it took away from my performance. So he said, I'd go through the script with them once, meaning Audrey Meadows, Art Carney, so on and so forth. Then he said, he was out doing this, that, and the other thing. He'd have a stand-in who would do the rehearsals with the other stars. And he would come back and he didn't miss a beat. And interesting too, when Johnny Carson asked him about this period, he said you also began to work with music. And Jackie Gleason goes, that's right. And Jackie Gleason could not read a stitch of music, could not write music. He produced 10 mood music albums from 1954 into the early 1960s, and they sold over 1 million copies. This is a man who couldn't write music, couldn't read music. He approached different music companies, and they said, no, you're a great comedian, but you don't read or write music. And Johnny Carson said, yeah, but you had Bobby Sackett playing with it. He goes, that's right, I wanted him. And Bobby Sackett was a great trumpet player and also played guitar. And Jackie Gleason said, I saw him in the Glenn Miller band playing guitar, but they used to let him play some sweet pieces. And he told Sackett, he said, someday I'm going to get an orchestra together, an acre of strings, you're going to play the horn, and we're going to make some music. And they did. In fact, interesting here, this is something that you might find fascinating. His first album, Music for Lovers Only, still holds the record for the longest stay on the Billboard Top 10 charts, 153 weeks. On the top 10 charts, 153 weeks, from a man who couldn't read or write music. He conducted it. And Johnny Carson said, well, what gave you the idea for this? He said, I was watching Clark Gable in a movie. And he says, here's Gable, tie and tails, made up, look great. And he said, he's romancing this girl. And he says, he gets this girl on the couch, and he's going to continue romancing her. He says, that's when the music comes in. And he said, the music filters in. And he says, it accentuated everything Gable was doing. And he said, I figured if Clark Gable needs music to romance a girl, some guy in Brooklyn must be desperate. And so this is when he came out with the music. And so Johnny Carson asked me, he says, well, didn't you make an album with 40 mandolin players? And Jackie Gleason says, for mandolin, he says, that was the time of all times. He says, 40 mandolin players down, this is New York City. He says, 40 mandolin players. You couldn't find a barber in 50 miles. And so he says, I get these 40 mandolin players. And he says, they all have hard picks, right? And they're playing away. And he said, it sounded like somebody threw a bed spring out the window. So he says, I sent out for soft picks. So he says, they're still playing. He says, it still sound a little raunchy. Then he says, what I did was I got a glass of water. And he said, I told all these mandolin players, stick your picks in this glass of water, soften them up. So he says, they all did this. They all sat down. They start playing again. Now the water's hitting them in the face from the picks. He says, these guys are getting ready to leave. They think I'm a nut. He says, but we got them to stay. We made the recording. We played it back and everything was fine. But he said that was a tough session. The Honeymooners. CBS wants to take that segment from the Jackie Gleason show and make it a standalone show. And Gleason says, yeah, fine. And so the 39 episodes you see on Channel 11 every week, which has been on since 1955-56. Gleason again was asked by Johnny Carson. He says, that must give you a kick. This is 1985. It's found a new generation of fans. And Jackie Gleason said, he admitted that yeah, he said, it's really gratifying when something you did 30 years ago is still a big hit, like the Lucy Show. Yeah, these were ace comedy shows put together by people who knew what the heck they were doing. And Gleason was the first one to use, which became popular at this point, the 3-camera system by the Dumont Camera Company. Lucy and Desi will follow this. And they were the first ones to use a 3-camera setup. So you get a better focus of the actors on stage. And Jackie Gleason's shows were live. You didn't have this canned laughter stuff. Because Gleason said, how are you going to know your show is good unless you got a bunch of people sitting in the audience watching it? And he said, of course, A lot of ad-libbing happened. For one time, Art Carney as Ed Norton, you know, Ralph Kramden threw him out of the apartment, get out. And Norton goes to the door and the door's stuck. Can't get the door open. This is while they're filming. This is on the show. There's a live audience. He said, so thinking real quick, Carney ran around Jackie Gleason, opened the window and went down a fire escape. Jackie Gleason goes, that's reasonable. You know, but this is the ad, you had to ad lib on this show. You had to ad lib back in the 50s. You didn't have the laugh machines and you didn't have, you know, this was all done live. And they did 39 episodes. And CBS said, okay, let's do another season, 56 to 57. Jackie Gleason says no. They thought he was kidding. This was a popular show. He said, we've been doing, Johnny Carson said, well, how come you didn't want to do it anymore? He said, counting the 39 episodes and counting it as part of the Jackie Gleason show, I've been doing this show for 5 years. And he said, I thought we were starting to run out of ideas. But he said, CBS thought he was kidding, that he had another job. He said, I didn't have another job. He said, I didn't have another job. But he said, I didn't want to do it anymore because I didn't want to force them. He says, I like the Honeymooners. I love doing them. But he said, I didn't want to ruin what we had done because what we had done was good. Here's a guy of principle here. Why, he says, why force it? And Carson goes, you're right. Why force it? He did make movies. Keep in mind, Johnny Carson said to him, he says, but you had great depth as an actor. Of course, many people remember him in The Hustler. He played Minnesota Fats, the pool player. And he also said we had Willie Moscone, one of the greatest pool players who ever lived, as the technical analyst for this movie. And Jackie Gleason, and he was nominated for an Oscar for this. He was nominated for an Oscar. And Gleason said, and Paul Newman became a darn good pool player for this picture, when he had to be. He also made Requiem for a Heavyweight, which I would urge you to watch. That movie's been done on stage too. He also made a movie in 1962-63, which I'm disappointed it didn't do better because I saw it as a kid in the movie theaters. Jackie Gleason arranged the music for this picture. The movie's about 85, 90 minutes long. It's called Gijo. And in this, an entire 90 minutes, he doesn't say a word. He plays a French deaf mute who befriends the daughter of a poor prostitute. That's the gist of the story. Jackie Gleason was one of those talented individuals who didn't need voice. He had the face. And another one, I'm going to bring it up next week. Another guy who's underrated because of his the way he molded his face sometimes was Richard Pryor. He could sell a scene with his face. That's talent. Ernie Kovacs was another one. Another great silent comedian, Red Skelton, the silent spot. You know, Jackie Gleason learned this. You know, all these guys learned this from people like who? Laurel and Hardy, Buster Keaton. Gleason was a big fan of Laurel and Hardy. So was Jerry Lewis. So was Dick Van Dyke. So, I mean, there were many of them. Peter Sellers, who did the Pink Panther movies, big fan of Laurel and Hardy. And so it's interesting where they learned and then they see what these masters did before them and then adopt for themselves. Gleason didn't need a voice. He was great with pantomime, a silent drama. He could mold his face so you could feel sorry for them. He could mold his face so you'd laugh. He had that talent besides the gift of gab here. In the 1960, he wanted to go to Miami because he was playing golf. He can't play golf 365 days a year in New York, but he can play golf 365 days in Florida. And CBS says, well, what do we got to do to keep you? And so Jackie Gleason goes, a train. CBS bought him a train. They bought Jackie, that's how much they wanted him. They bought him a train. And because he was going to move the Jackie Gleason Show from New York to Miami Beach. And he did an interview with Morley Safer, 60 Minutes, 1984, which is another interview worth watching. And Safer says, they bought you a train. They bought him a train. He said, how many bars? Any bars? I had 2 bars. And they drank like over 1,000 miles to Florida. What a time they had. Girls all over the place. And he set up the Jackie Gleason Show in Miami Beach, had his own studio, stage, so on and so forth. And he came out, had a magazine called the American Scene Magazine. And this is where these characters like Crazy Guggenheim, Joe the Bartender, but it was a great variety show. They had great skits. And if you can YouTube some of this, you'll break your ribs laughing. You really will. And later on, late 60s, he began to change the flavor of it. He reintroduced the Honeymooners, although Audrey Meadows is not on this. Jane Keane played Trixie, and Sheila McRae was Alice. And they did this and Art Carney came back as Ed Norton. And this show lasted until 1970. Jackie Gleason after that did a lot of spots like on Bob Hope's show, maybe a guest on Dean Martin, a lot of other shows, but he did make a few movies after this. One of them was Smokey and the Bandit. I'm sure some of you remember that movie with him as Buford T. Justice, the sheriff, right? And I believe it was Burt Reynolds who said, why don't we get Gleason to play the sheriff? And they did. And Burt Reynolds said, it was one of the movies I had one of the greatest times making. And Johnny Carson one time asked Burt Reynolds when Reynolds was on, I understand you and Jerry Reed and them were drinking by 11 o'clock in the morning. Where was Jackie? And Burt Reynolds says, are you kidding? He's already drinking at 6. And he made another movie later on, but before the Smokey and the Bandit. And there was a movie written, a book written about Jackie Gleason called How Sweet It Is. And the author was a good drinking buddy of Jackie Gleason. And Johnny Carson said, when you were making movies, they didn't want him on the set. And Jackie Gleason said, no, they thought he was a bad companion for me. Because they knew when he showed up, he said they were afraid I'd start drinking and I'd get plowed. And he goes, and they were right. But he never missed a performance, even with the drinking bouts. Jackie Gleason had really been retired by 1985, and he'll die in 1987. He was 71 years old. And I remember when I'm preparing for this talk, I was watching the Morley Safer interview, and Morley Safer interviewed Jackie Gleason down at his home in Florida, at Gleason's home in Florida, and they're down in the basement playing pool. And Safer says, we want to play some pool? Sure, we'll play pool. And Gleason, let him sink a few balls, but it shows Morley Safer standing there with his pool cue. After a while, as Gleason is sinking ball after ball after ball after ball, and he's not missing a beat. And finally, when they were done, Morley Safer's on one side of the pool table, and Gleason's on the other. And Morley Safer says to him, it's really the end of the interview, and he says, do you really think you're the great one? And Gleason, typical Gleason, lights a cigarette, takes a puff, blows the smoke out, and leans across the table and said, I just beat you playing pool, didn't I? Jackie Gleason, he was the great one. And those who weren't born when he was around, watch The Honeymooners. Any movie he's in, watch. He's a terrific actor. He once said he said to Johnny Carson the night he was on, Carson said, "You have great depth as an actor." And Gleason said, "Well, you know, John, it's a funny thing. There are a number of comedians who do a dramatic role and turn out to be great actors. But how many great dramatic actors turn out to be great comedians?" And Carson had to agree with him. And one of the people I'll talk about next week, Robin Williams, was as good a dramatic actor perhaps as you'll find. He was that talented. But Gleason was in a class by himself. And it's too bad he died when he did at age 71. And I'll leave you with this. Gleason, Johnny Carson asked him at the end of the interview he did with him in 85, "Is there anything you haven't done? Anything you missed doing?" And Gleason said, no. He says, "I've done quite a bit." He says, "A lot of it was good." He said, some laid a few bombs. And he says, "But on the whole," and he said, and he also said, he says, "But many think you make it on your talent." He says, "You got to have luck." And he says, "If you don't have luck," he said, "it's not just talent." And then he says, "Talent, you can't take credit for that." Why? He says, "Talent's a gift from God." So he says, next time someone tells you you're good, tell them God did it. And that's when Johnny Carson tapped him on the shoulder. He says, "On your case." And that was the end of the interview. And of course, Jackie Gleason, when he first came on, Johnny Carson said, he says, "Would you do me a favor?" He says, "Do it once and then we'll get on with this." And Jackie Gleason knew exactly what he was asking for. And he put his hand up near his collar and he said, "How sweet it is." And of course, the whole place came down. Jackie Gleason, class by himself. Anybody have any questions or comments or observations to make, or even memories of watching these shows on television? Floor is yours.
Mark?
Yes, sir.
So one of the roles for which Jackie Gleason got a lot of acclaim was Soldier in the Rain. I was wondering if you had anything in your back pocket to talk about that role and how he felt about that.
Well, Jackie Gleason felt strongly about any role he took, because besides being a funny man, he was a serious actor. That movie, again, it's a shame in the way that Gleason never really got, and that Soldier in the Rain, Guizot, didn't go over well at the box office, Eric, but to me, it's one of his better portrayals because he doesn't say a word. It's just pantomime, and that takes talent to pull that off. He did get the Oscar nomination for The Hustler. The Requiem for a Heavyweight. It was terrific. He never really got the credit due him, though, as a dramatic actor, and that includes Soldier in the Rain. Johnny Carson brought this up. He never got an Emmy. Imagine, he never got an Emmy. He did get a Tony for Broadway. I forgot the play, but he got a Tony on Broadway. He got one Oscar nomination, but he never got an Emmy really for television work. And Johnny Carson said, the academy that gives out the Emmys ought to be taken 20 miles off California and dropped in the drink. He said, "There's something wrong here." The public loved him, but his talents as an actor, maybe because he didn't make as many movies, maybe that's the reason why. But like Soldier in the Rain, The Hustler, again, I'll add Guizot, Requiem for Heavyweight. He was a great dramatic actor, but he just didn't get the accolades for that. Yes,
Mark,
yes, Catherine.
do you know anything about his personal life? Spouses, children, anything like that?
Yeah, he was married. He was married, and he had his daughter's name. I forgot his daughter's married name, but he did have one grandson. His family really doesn't get much of a play here. But Gleason was could be a little bit standoffish in his off time, but though he was willing to help some of the other actors and actresses. Now, supposedly he helped bring Art Carney back when Art Carney began to tip the arm too. But Gleason had no problem tipping the arm. But his family, I really didn't get into his family too deep because I concentrated more on him because I was so enamored with Jackie Gleason as a performer.
Yeah.
He is attractive from that perspective alone because I was attracted by his innovations in comedy, the 3-camera system, but also his music. A guy can't read or write. And, he would hum bars, and you got people who know how to write music would take it down. Okay, now we got something here, but he couldn't write or read. Again, he was very talented. He moved out of the idea of not being a writer or a reader of music, but put together 10 albums.
Yeah.
Who the heck does this? Gleason.
Yeah.
Gleason. But I didn't get too deep into his family. After his mother and father, because that was a tragic aspect of the story here. I guess it's a good thing he didn't wind up in a street gang, dead in a street someplace. But again, he was, even though he he never went to college, but he was a voracious reader. Interesting, some of these actors coming out of this era, or just on the cut, or just on the edge of this era, moving up in the 1950s, like Neville Brand. You remember the actor Neville Brand?
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
He was the guy who played Al Capone on The Untouchables in the early part of that TV show.
Yeah.
He did a lot of B westerns. He was in some war movies, and he was on a western show on TV. It wasn't Laramie. I forgot the name of that show, but he was a gruff character. The guy was a voracious reader. When he finally had enough money, he bought a home. He had a library of 30,000 books. You wouldn't know it listening to him on these movies. I mean, he sounded like he didn't get past the 8th grade, for Pete's sakes. But the tragedy in that story is the house had a fire. He was really housebroken. He lost a lot of his books, but he was a voracious reader, and so was Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah,
So it's interesting when you go back into the background of some of these people, what they're doing off stage. It's fascinating. It truly is.
A lot of that
Jimmy
has
Stewart was a bomber pilot.
Well, I think that a lot of that.
Beg your pardon?
And a lot of that also has to do with the fact that a lot of them, not all, didn't graduate high school. And so they made up for it on their own.
Right. Well, it's like Jackie Gleason too. Remember with Alice? Bang, zoom, going to the moon, Alice. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. He was a fan of outer space, astronomy, and supposedly, Jerry Ford invited him to go see that Hangar 19.
Oh.
18.
Supposedly.
Wow.
Hangar 18. Yeah. He was interested like an outer. I'm not that he was a sci-fi flick freak in the 1950s like I am. I mean, I'm a sucker for when those come on. Rosemary says, "You want to do?" No, Earth versus the Flying Saucers on. I'm going to watch this, and I do. I'm still a sucker for those movies. But
so Mark, one of these days I'll have to tell you about my saucer sighting.
No, honey, this is not.
Oh boy.
Nothing to do with it.
But again, a lot of these actors and actresses, we can't forget them either. They had a life other than the stage, and some of it was interesting. Some of it's fascinating. Like Leslie, remember the English actor Leslie Howard?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
He was in the British Secret Service. That's how he got killed in 1942.
Yes, I knew that.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, his plane got shot down. And the British government didn't send a warning out to salvage the plane, because then the Germans would have known they broke the German code.
Oh,
So
right.
it's interesting when you take a look at what some of these people, and Jackie Gleason,
Hayden.
yeah, they wanted to draft him, but he was too much overweight, and they said, nope, nah, you can't, they're not taking you.
Yeah,
Not
Sterling
taking-
Hayden
oh.
worked for the OSS in Yugoslavia.
Right. Sterling Hayden, interesting, used to live in Westport, Wilton, and he used to be a customer for Klein's, and that friend of mine, Bob, which I told you before we started here, used to work there. Sterling Hayden was one of his clients, and Bob asked him, he says, hey, you have any regrets from Hollywood? He goes, yeah, one. Well, you don't have to tell me. No, I'll tell you. He says, I should have beat the tar out of Ronald Reagan. Because Reagan was a stool pigeon for the McCarthy hearings.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And he said, I should have punched the living, what out of him.
yeah.
He says, I didn't do that. And so it's interesting. A lot, like I said, a lot of these people are fascinating. I mean, Jackie Gleason is really one of my favorites. I really like doing Gleason himself, because there's a lot going on there. He was a very serious person when it came to doing these productions. Everything had to be done just right. But at the same time, he didn't need to rehearse, because he had somewhat of a photographic memory. Once he did the rehearsal once, he's all set to go. He's all set to go, which not everybody can do. Not everybody can do that. He could. So he's a very talented individual. Very talented individual. Fascinating. Anybody else have any questions or observations on Gleason, or something along those lines? I mean, I can go on with this all day about these other, like those others TV shows. They were great shows. That was a great time for television. It truly was, because a lot of it was live, not canned. Not canned, like the Sid Caesar, the show of shows with Sid Caesar. That kind of thing. Anyway, anybody else have any questions or observations?
Nope.
No? I will be back next week, and next week we're doing two. I'm doing Richard Pryor, and Robin Williams. And when I do Robin Williams, you're also going to hear a little bit about Jonathan Winters, because that was Robin Williams' comic idol. And Robin Williams virtually adored Jonathan Winters. And that was one of my favorites. Jonathan Winters was like Robin Williams. I mean, these are people you don't need to write a script for. Robin Williams said, in fact, before that talk, I would urge you, if you're into this, you can YouTube when Robin Williams and Jonathan Winters were on the same night on the Johnny Carson show. You want to break your ribs. That's where you're going to do it. And before Jonathan Winters came out, Johnny Carson asked Robin Williams, well, how many episodes was on Mork and Mindy was Jonathan Winters? And Robin Williams said about 20. And he said, we were filming. He said, they run out of film. And script? What script? They just boom. They played off one another, and it's magic. That doesn't happen all the time. You get two great comic geniuses. That's magic, and you enjoy it while it lasts. And on that night on the Johnny Carson show, I really like that. I thought it was one of the best Carson shows, because when Jonathan Winters came out, watching Robin Williams laugh, I mean, really watching him laugh. And he really did that night. Once Jonathan Winters came out, it's fun just to watch Robin Williams laugh at Jonathan Winters. Really worth the effort, really is. And the Jackie Gleason interview on Johnny Carson which was in October of 1985. It's really worth watching. Gleason tells some of the stuff that, people probably really didn't know about. It's really worth watching. They are. They're in classes by themselves. They truly are. But anybody else have any observations or questions? No? Oh, I will be back in May too. I'm doing one in May. If you want to know what that is, I can tell you right now. Let's see, May. It's not anything to do with entertainment. You might as well know that now. It's going to be May 27th, and we're right around the corner from Memorial Day. And it's political. It's to mark the 160th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. That's what that's going to be. May 27th. The inaugural address is actually in March, on March 4, 1861, but we'll consider it 160 years. And then in June, I'm going to do another. And this is going to be one of my personal favorites. It's the 160th anniversary of this, and it's in the correct month, the Balloon Corps. It is the United States Army's first sojourn into air power in 1861. And in this talk, the handout that I'm going to have for this talk, we'll have a copy of it. Abraham Lincoln is the first head of state in history to receive an electronic message from an aircraft in the air, which is going to be a balloon, to the ground. And the handout is going to have that in that transcript in it. And you're also going to find out Abraham Lincoln's part in trying to get the balloon course started. And it irks me that whenever people talk about Lincoln, that is conveniently left out. And if you have any doubts about this, where I work in Army Aviation Magazine doing historical research, I have the entire roster of transcripts which Thaddeus Lowe forwarded to the United States Army for the archives. I have that entire archive. I have that entire roster in my archives. It was actually finally put together by the Army in 1899. And they're interesting to read. But part of this was Abraham Lincoln. I think you'll find that interesting, and I know I still do. But otherwise, unless anyone else has any additional questions, that's it. That's it.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. It was a real pleasure.
Well, it's a lot of fun. It beats watching the soap operas.
And thank you, Shelley.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It has been wonderful. And please sign up for the next one. That'll be next Tuesday, right, Mark? Mhm.
Right. Next Monday, I believe. Yeah, next Monday.
Next Monday.
26th.
Let me see.
Okay, why don't we just, if all they're going to do is do this.
Let me see.
I can
I
look it
think
up.
I have April 27th. Am I right? Tuesday?
I got April 26th, but I can do Tuesday night. It makes no difference to me, really.
Okay. Mhm. Yeah, I have it
I'm
on
good
the,
either night.
I have it on the
Me-
calendar.
27th is fine. That's fine.
6:30
That's
to
fine.
8. Uh-huh.
Right.
It will be on Zoom, and we just want to encourage each of you, please sign it up, and we would love to see everybody.
No, the
Here.
27th, though, the 27th works because I can watch one of those sci-fi movies on Monday night.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Mark. You are amazing. I just learned so much from you.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you. And have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thanks for coming.
And have yourselves a great evening and stay well.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye now.